Let me tell you something about being loved and overlooked at the same time. It carves you hollow in a way that hugs can't always fill. My name is Eva Mercer. I'm 27 now, but this part of my story starts in a town so small it didn't even have its own Walmart until I turned 13. Until recently, I believed decency was a kind of shield, and that if you gave love, quietly, steadily, it would eventually wrap itself around you in return. But I was wrong. Love isn't always louder than ambition. And sometimes, the people who share your blood will trade you like old lumber if they think it'll buy them a better porch. I grew up in a weather-worn house off County Road 6, tucked behind a row of sugar maples that my grandfather planted before I was born. My mom, Amelia, used to call it our own little lighthouse, though it leaned more toward creaky than charming. My father walked out when I was 3, left a note that said, "I need air," like we were smothering him by existing. My mom never talked about him after that. I learned early not to ask questions that opened wounds. She raised me alone, or maybe it's more accurate to say we were both raised, me into a girl, her into a woman who stopped hoping. We lived paycheck to paycheck, and she worked long hours at the grocery store in town. She was the kind of woman who never argued at customer service counters and always returned the buggy to the rack. She thought dignity meant silence, and for a long time, so did I. But there was one person who made me feel like I wasn't just background noise in the world, my grandfather, Harold Mercer. He was my mother's father, and the only man who never looked through me. A retired carpenter with hands like leather and a voice that felt like warm gravel, he taught me everything I know about ethics, legacy, and the difference between building something that lasts and something that just sells. When I was 7, he handed me a block of wood, a small hammer, and said, "You ever want to know what a person's made of? Give him a project and step back." That summer we built a birdhouse, then a bookshelf, then a little wooden box with a false bottom. He taught me how to sand the grain until it gleamed, how to line up the joints so they didn't scream when pressure came. But mostly, he taught me to pay attention, to people, to silence, to what gets said in rooms when no one thinks you're listening. Which brings me to Uncle Richard. If Harold was the rock of our family, Richard was the oil slick that sat on top. He was Harold's only son, but you wouldn't know it by how often they fought. Richard wore cologne that could knock out a raccoon and suits that looked expensive in a way that made you suspicious. He called himself a real estate consultant, but people in town whispered that he sold other people's dreams and pocketed the change. He'd only blow into town a few times a year, usually around tax season or when someone was dying, and every time he did, tension would bloom in our house like mildew. He'd show up in a leased black SUV with a Bluetooth earpiece clipped to his head like a parasite and start commenting on everything. The furniture was outdated. The neighborhood was dying. I had such a sensitive face, like I read too many books. When I was 9, he gave me a calculator for Christmas. Not one of the fun ones with sparkles or games. A big gray one with tax buttons and a sticky 5 key. To help with school, he said, smirking, or emotions. Harold's jaw twitched, but he didn't say anything that time. The last time Richard visited while my grandfather was still alive, I was 12. I'd gone into the garage to put away a set of chisels I'd borrowed and heard voices coming from the other side of the workbench wall. They didn't know I was there. I wasn't supposed to be there. But I stood still, not breathing, because the tone in Harold's voice had shifted, low, tight, the way it only got when something sacred had been stained. "You think I don't know what you're doing, Richard?" my grandfather hissed. "Selling off family land, promising plots that don't belong to you? You're a thief in a suit." Richard laughed, that fake Wall Street chuckle he always used when he was losing control. "You always did think this town owed you something, Dad. That respect was a currency that'd get you interest. What I earned," Harold said, his voice breaking slightly, "was honor. You're out here hawking pieces of your childhood like they're poker chips." That was the first time I heard my grandfather cry. I pressed my back to the wall, hands shaking, and for the first time I understood something I hadn't had words for until much later. Sometimes, the people who share your blood don't inherit your values. Sometimes, they spend them. After that fight, Harold didn't speak about Richard again. Not to me, not to Mom. But the look in his eyes when he sounded would changed. It wasn't just focus anymore, it was grief. Mom tried to keep the peace, as she always did. He's still family, she whispered, more to herself than to me. He just lost his way. But I didn't want peace. I wanted truth. And from that day on, I started to watch more closely how people moved, what they said when they thought no one was paying attention, what they did when legacy became inconvenient. Because even at 12, I understood this: fairness doesn't always get the microphone. Sometimes, it's just the echo left behind after someone else's win. And I was tired of being the echo. There is a kind of fatigue that burrows so deep into your bones it stops feeling like exhaustion and starts feeling like identity. By the time I was 23, I had become a woman who carried coffee stains on her coat like battle scars, who memorized bus schedules like scripture, and who measured her day in exhausted exhales between shifts. I worked the morning rush at a local diner, refilling burnt pots of coffee and dodging the grabby hands of regulars who didn't remember my name but always remembered their toast, and spent evenings behind the front desk at the community center, where I answered phones for therapists and shuffled appointment cards for people with heavier problems than mine. Between those two jobs and night classes at the local college, I lived like a ghost in my own life. My major was social work, a field that made my mom furrow her brow every time I mentioned it, her voice laced with tired concern as she asked, "But Eva, will that even pay enough to live?" What she didn't understand, what I could never quite articulate without sounding foolish, was that I didn't choose this path for money. I chose it because someone had to be the person who showed up when things got too hard to carry alone. Because no one had shown up for my mom when my dad walked out. Because my grandfather, Harold Mercer, had been the only person who ever taught me how to stay standing when the ground shifted beneath your feet. It was around that time, somewhere between a double shift and another failed quiz in my policy class, that I received a letter. Not an email. Not a text. A proper, handwritten letter addressed to me in Harold's careful, looping script. The envelope was thick, the paper smelled faintly of cedar, and the ink had bled just slightly in places where he must have paused to think too long. The first line read, "If you're reading this, it means I've been thinking about the future more than I like to admit." I remember sitting cross-legged on my narrow bed in the small rental apartment above a laundromat, my dinner untouched beside me, as I read and reread every word like it was prophecy. In the letter, Harold talked about the house, that creaky, warm place tucked behind the sugar maples that had once felt like the only shelter in the world that saw me. He wrote about how the land had been in our family for 3 generations and how he wanted it to go to someone who still believes in things being made instead of sold. He said I had calloused hands and a kind heart, and that he couldn't think of a better steward for what he'd built. I cried for a long time that night. Not because I wanted the house, not really. I cried because someone saw me. Because someone knew how hard I was trying to become something solid in a world that rewarded shortcuts and shine. That letter became a secret anchor I carried in my bag, folded between my notebooks and half-graded assignments. On the hardest nights, when I felt like I was losing pieces of myself to exhaustion, I'd pull it out and let his words remind me why I was doing any of this at all. But hope is a fragile thing, especially when you cling to it too tightly. Because not long after that letter arrived, Harold got sick. At first, it was small things. He'd repeat stories without realizing, forget whether he'd eaten lunch, lose track of what day it was. We all brushed it off as old age, the way families do when denial is easier than facing what's coming. But then came the collapse in the garden, the confused call to 911 where he couldn't remember his own address, and the ER doctor's voice that didn't try to soften the truth when he said late-stage vascular dementia and "we recommend full-time care as soon as possible." I dropped one of my jobs within the week. I couldn't afford to, not really, but I also couldn't stomach the idea of him being cared for by strangers in a place that smelled like antiseptic and despair. So I moved into the guest room of the house, our house, and started caring for him myself. I cooked meals he sometimes forgot to eat, read him his old woodworking journals, and watched as the sharp, steady man I adored slipped further into confusion with each passing week. And then, as if summoned by the scent of opportunity, Uncle Richard returned. He called it a visit and said he wanted to reconnect with Dad before it was too late. He brought gifts, bottles of expensive wine Harold couldn't drink anymore, leather gloves he no longer had the dexterity to wear, and he wore the same smug smile he'd always worn, the kind that turned every sentence into a transaction. I didn't trust him, not for a second, but I was so overwhelmed with caregiving and coursework and the slow grief of watching someone die in pieces that I couldn't do much more than grit my teeth and smile politely. Richard started staying longer each time. He began reorganizing things around the house, filing cabinets, drawers, Harold's old toolbox. He said he was trying to help, but I knew better. I caught him once in the attic with a box of old documents spread around him like cards at a poker table. When I asked what he was looking for, he smiled and said, "Just trying to get Dad's affairs in order, sweetheart. You've done a fine job holding down the fort, but this kind of stuff's a little above your pay grade, wouldn't you say?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to shove him down the stairs and scream at the top of my lungs that this house wasn't his, that he didn't get to show up and play hero just because Harold was too far gone to see what was happening. But I didn't. Because I was tired. Because I was afraid. Because my mother, sweet, conflict-averse Amelia, told me to pick my battles. And so, I stayed silent. I stayed up at night writing essays about child welfare while my grandfather moaned in his sleep down the hall, and my uncle sharpened his lies in the next room over. The end came faster than I expected. One morning, I brought Harold his tea and found him sitting upright in bed, eyes open but unseeing, breath shallow. I called 911, but I already knew. He was gone. The funeral was small, held in the same church where he had once helped build the pews. Richard made a show of being the grieving son, shaking hands and accepting condolences like he was the rightful heir to every memory. My mother cried softly beside me, dabbing her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, while I stared at the casket and felt something inside me hollow out completely. 2 weeks later, we gathered in a cold, sterile office downtown for the reading of the will. I wore Harold's flannel jacket, the one that still smelled like cedar and pipe smoke, as if it could shield me from whatever storm was coming. The lawyer, a pale man with watery eyes and a nameplate that read Donovan, shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. And then the world shifted on its axis. According to the will, everything was going to Richard. The house. The savings account. The woodworking tools. The land. Even the damn birdhouses Harold and I built together. All of it. There was no mention of the letter. No mention of me. I sat there frozen, my fingers digging into the armrest, as Donovan read clause after clause in a monotone voice that felt like betrayal wrapped in legalese. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder as we left, his grip firm. "He must have changed it near the end," he said, feigning sympathy. "You know how the mind goes. Maybe he forgot he promised you anything at all." I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. But all I could do was nod and walk out into the rain, wondering if love meant anything at all when it couldn't survive a signature. When I told my mother that something was wrong, that I knew Harold wouldn't have done this willingly, she looked at me with exhausted eyes and said, "Eva, please. Let it go. For peace." Peace? What peace? I was supposed to be the one who carried on his legacy, who honored his memory with every nail, every piece of grain-sanded wood. Instead, I was left with nothing but debts, night classes, and a silence that felt like punishment for trusting too deeply. That night, I pulled the letter from my bag and reread it under the flickering light of my apartment. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if being good had been my biggest mistake. There are certain truths that the world seems determined to bury beneath civility and protocol, as if a lie signed in ink carries more weight than a promise spoken with love. I moved out of Harold's house the morning after the will reading, clutching nothing but a backpack stuffed with my work uniform, a few notebooks, and the cedar-scented flannel he used to wear when the evenings turned cool. Richard didn't give me time to grieve properly. His voice had been clipped, efficient, like a landlord managing a tenant over text. "You've got until 10, he said, barely glancing up from his phone. "No hard feelings. I'm sure Grandpa loved you in his own way." That line haunted me for weeks. My new apartment sat above a shuttered pawn shop with peeling paint and a rusted mailbox that barely clung to the siding. The stairs creaked like something in mourning, and the tap in the bathroom screamed every time I brushed my teeth. Still, it was mine. Or at least, it was the only place I could afford on the ragged edge of what I earned between my night shifts and leftover scholarship scraps. I didn't sleep much those first few weeks. Grief has a way of making the walls close in, and mine were made of drywall and bad decisions. I kept replaying the will reading in my head, the way Richard's face never once registered surprise, the way Donovan the lawyer kept glancing at Richard like they were in on some private joke. Every time I thought about it, a heavy knot formed in my stomach, a weight that settled somewhere behind my ribs and refused to move. One night, a week after I'd left the house, I sat cross-legged on the floor with Harold's letter in front of me, unfolded so many times it had started to fray along the seams. I read it again and again until the words started to blur. You know the value of building, not selling. You understand what this place means. Real things are hidden in plain sight. That last line. It clung to me like wood dust after sanding, subtle, stubborn, impossible to shake. I closed my eyes and tried to remember his voice, the way he always said the phrase like a warning or a lesson. He used it whenever he was fixing something, whether it was a jammed drawer or a broken relationship. People look too hard, he'd say, when half the time the truth's sitting right in front of their eyes. I opened my eyes and knew exactly where I needed to go. The workshop. Harold's real sanctuary wasn't the house or the porch or the garden he tended in the mornings, it was the detached shed behind the garage, the one he called his cathedral. No one had touched it since his death. Richard had focused all his attention on the house, the land, the bank accounts, but the workshop? That was just an old man's hobby shack in his eyes. To me, it was a vault. The next day, I waited until late afternoon and drove back to the property, parking 2 streets over and walking through the woods behind the house like I used to as a kid when I wanted to sneak out unnoticed. The back gate still squeaked in that familiar way when I pushed it open. The house itself looked unchanged, but somehow colder, like it knew it had betrayed someone it once loved. I didn't go near it. I went straight to the shed. The workshop smelled like sawdust and memory. The scent hit me so hard I had to grip the doorframe to steady myself. The dust hung in the air, undisturbed, sacred. His workbench sat exactly as he'd left it, half-sanded block of oak on the corner, notes pinned above, the small wooden figure of a cardinal he carved for me when I was 8 still perched on the shelf. I moved slowly, reverently. I ran my hand along the edge of the bench, pausing at the locked tool chest Harold always kept beneath. The brass key he used to wear on a leather string around his neck flashed in my mind. I hadn't seen it since the hospital. I crouched beside the chest, searching the side panels. That's when I remembered something else he always said, something that sounded like nonsense until now. You don't build to hide something. You hide something while building. My fingers found the seam on the bottom slat, barely perceptible, but not smooth. I tapped around it gently, and something shifted. A panel popped loose with a click so soft I almost missed it. Inside the hidden compartment was an envelope, sealed with wax and marked with Harold's signature scrawl. My name was written on the front. I don't remember how long I sat there staring at it. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal. Inside was a will. A real one. It was dated 6 months before his health started to decline, notarized, witnessed, and written in Harold's voice, clear, direct, and entirely different from the clinical language in the one read at Donovan's office. He left the house to me. The land. The tools. His savings. Everything. To Eva Lynn Mercer, who knows how to build what matters and protect it, he wrote. To my blood and spirit, not just in name. I sat on the floor of that workshop, the will clutched in my lap, and let the rage crawl up my spine like fire. When I got back to my apartment that night, I laid both documents side by side, the one Donovan had read, which I'd obtained a scanned copy of from the probate court, and the one Harold had hidden away like a last hope. The differences were small but damning. The signature on the court filed will was slightly off, the way the H curled inward, the slope of the D in Mercer. Not drastically so, but if you knew Harold's handwriting like I did, you'd see it immediately. The pen pressure on the filed copy was too smooth, like it had been written all at once, not with the pauses Harold always took to steady his hand. The dates didn't align with his hospital records either. He was in a memory care facility the day that version was supposedly signed. And the witnesses? They were names I didn't recognize, with addresses that traced back to one of Richard's shell companies when I checked. It was forgery. Clear. Deliberate. And cruel. I brought the evidence to 2 local attorneys. One was a weary woman in a cluttered office above a bridal shop. She looked over the documents, adjusted her glasses, and said, "It's suspicious, no doubt, but do you have the funds to challenge this in court? Because Richard Mercer has money and a team. This could take years." The second lawyer didn't even get past the second page. He looked at my threadbare coat and asked, "Do you have any assets we can put up for retainer?" They didn't believe me, or maybe they did, but not enough to risk their time on a girl with calloused hands and an unpaid phone bill. Richard, on the other hand, was thriving. He started appearing in the local paper, giving interviews about restoring his father's legacy and modernizing the property. He turned the garden into a manicured mess with paid landscapers who never once asked what those old rose bushes had meant to Harold. He began posting online pictures of the house, the land, captioned with phrases like family first and honoring Dad's memory. It made me sick. When I confronted him, he laughed. On the sidewalk outside his office, in a crisp blue suit, holding an oat milk latte, he looked me up and down and said, "You're grieving. That's understandable. But don't embarrass yourself chasing shadows. Dad loved you, sure, but you're not entitled to anything just because you helped him wipe his mouth." I didn't respond. Not to him. Not that day. But I started taking notes. Names. Signatures. Dates. Records. I filed every discrepancy in a spreadsheet. I reached out to handwriting analysts, one of whom agreed to review the signatures pro bono. She emailed me 2 weeks later with her preliminary findings. Signatures do not appear to be from the same hand. Strong indicators of forgery. Still, no one wanted to touch the case officially. Too risky. Not enough leverage. You'll bankrupt yourself before you get to court. And through it all, my mother kept saying the same damn thing, "Let it go, Eva. Just let it go. It's not worth destroying yourself over." But she didn't understand. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about the money. It was about the truth. About the man who raised me with principles, who told me to sand every piece of wood like it was a gift, who once said, "You don't just build things to last, Eva, you build them to mean something." And I was not going to let a thief in a suit rewrite that legacy in the language of greed. The problem with curated grief is that it always leaves fingerprints. There's a polish to it, a sheen too clean to be real, like a showroom kitchen that's never known the chaos of spilled sauce or laughter through smoke alarms. That's what Harold's funeral felt like, staged, sterile, dressed in symmetry and silence. Richard had arranged it down to the minute, as if mourning could be scheduled like a real estate open house. The obituary ran full page in the Midland Sentinel, accompanied by a black and white portrait that Harold would have hated, posed, uptight, lacking the stubborn grin he always wore when he finished a good piece of woodwork. Richard described him as a pillar of the community and a man whose legacy lives on in tradition and structure. Not once did he mention sawdust. Not once did he mention soul. The morning of the funeral, I stood in front of my cracked mirror, palms sweaty around the edges of a folded envelope. Inside was the original will, now notarized and verified by a second independent handwriting analyst who had confirmed its authenticity. Clipped to it was a short typed memo from a retired legal clerk who had known Harold for years and had agreed to testify, if needed, that Harold had shown her a version of that will during a community center conversation the year prior. But it wasn't just documents I was bringing with me. No. I also had something far more human, something raw and irrefutable in a way paper never could be. The voicemail. 3 weeks before Harold died, during one of his more lucid mornings, he had left me a message. I'd saved it, listened to it over and over in the sleepless weeks since. It was brief, his voice thinner than usual, but it carried that unmistakable edge of clarity that sometimes broke through his confusion like sunlight through stained glass. Eva, sweetheart. I don't know how much longer I've got. If anything happens, check the workshop. Don't trust Richard. He's been sniffing around the wrong drawers. You're the only one who knows how to carry what I built. The will, look beneath the chest. It's for you. You earned it. I just hope it gets to you in time. I hadn't planned to use it. At first, I'd kept it like a lullaby, something to remind me that I wasn't crazy. That the man I loved, the man who raised me to see the good in splinters and sweat, hadn't forgotten me in the end. But now? After the gaslighting, the public lies, the polished cruelty of Richard's media campaign? Now, I would use it as my hammer. The funeral was held at St. Luke's Episcopal, a tall, cold church with blue glass windows and polished pews that seemed allergic to real grief. Richard had spared no expense. There were calla lilies on every aisle and a string quartet tuning near the altar. Everyone had been handed a celebration of life booklet that opened with a full-color timeline of Harold's achievements. I counted 8 pictures of Richard. 2 of Harold. I sat in the 4th row, alone, dressed in a plain black coat with Harold's flannel stitched into the lining. A local journalist named Miriam sat 2 rows behind me. We had gone to high school together, and she had gone on to work for a local investigative blog. I had reached out to her a week ago with the documents and voicemail. She'd replied with a single line, "I'll be there. Don't hold back." The service began with hymns Harold never liked. Then came the polished voice of Pastor Edwards, who had barely known Harold but spoke with the authority of a man hired to make death feel like closure. Then, Richard stepped up to the pulpit. He wore a charcoal suit and a tragic expression that seemed borrowed from a soap opera. He cleared his throat and launched into a eulogy that made my skin crawl. My father was a man of vision, he began, his voice steady and rehearsed. He taught me the value of structure, of perseverance, of planting roots that outlast our own seasons. This land, this home, his legacy, it now lives in us, in what we build, and what we protect. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. He went on for 5 more minutes, about Harold's generosity, his commitment to family, and how proud Harold would have been to see the renovations Richard was already planning for the family home. That was when I stood up. The sound of my chair scraping the hardwood echoed louder than the hymns had. Eyes turned. Gasps fluttered through the pews like birds startled from branches. I stepped into the aisle, my heels clicking with more certainty than I felt, the envelope clutched tightly in my right hand, my phone in the other. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cutting through the silence with a clarity that surprised even me. "But there's one more thing that needs to be said before this becomes a monument to a lie." Richard froze mid-sentence. His hands gripped the sides of the pulpit. "Eva, not now. Please sit down." I didn't. I turned to the crowd, half of them relatives, the other half townspeople who had known Harold longer than Richard had even lived in state. Harold Mercer was a man who believed in legacy, yes, I said, but not in the way Richard has made you believe. He didn't care about appearances. He didn't care about flowers or press releases or curated grief. I held up the phone and pressed play. His voice filled the church, thin but resolute. The silence was absolute. Even the pastor didn't move. "Check the workshop. Don't trust Richard, it's for you. You earned it." Gasps. A cry near the front. Someone dropped their program. Richard stepped back like he'd been slapped. Then I pulled out the envelope. "This," I said, "is the original will. Dated 6 months before Harold was declared legally incapacitated. Signed in his hand. Verified by 2 analysts. Witnessed. Hidden, just like he told me it would be." I walked to the front, placed the envelope on the altar like it was a sacred offering, and turned to Miriam, who was already standing, phone recording, her expression sharp with professional hunger. This man, I pointed to Richard, filed a forged will. He used false witnesses. He bypassed legal procedure. He erased me from Harold's life to claim an inheritance he didn't earn, and he did it with the confidence of someone who thought no one would question him. The room was chaos now. Voices overlapping. Chairs shifting. A few older family members stood. My cousin Lila burst into tears. Aunt Colleen started shouting Richard's name, demanding answers. The string quartet had stopped playing. The pastor looked like he wanted to evaporate. And Richard? He tried to recover. He slammed his hand on the pulpit and shouted over the noise. She's lying. She's unwell. This is grief, that's all it is. She's been obsessed ever since the will reading. This is slander. But the fury in his voice didn't sound like indignation, it sounded like panic. A journalist's camera flashed. That was the moment everything shifted. The next morning, the headline on Miriam's blog read, "Granddaughter exposes forged will at funeral, small town legacy torn by truth." By noon, it was on local radio. By evening, the Midland Sentinel had picked it up. They printed the photo of me standing at the altar, envelope in hand, with the caption, "Eva Mercer challenges family fraud at grandfather's funeral." People started calling. Lawyers. Journalists. Family members who had previously ghosted me now texted to say they were so sorry or always suspected something was off. Even Donovan the lawyer left a trembling voicemail saying he had acted under professional assumption and may need to reassess prior actions. But none of that made me feel victorious. Not even a little. Because as I sat in my quiet apartment that night, reading the article, listening again to Harold's voicemail, watching Richard's empire unravel in public, all I felt was hollow. He was still gone. Harold, my grandfather, my anchor, my safe place, was still dead. No headline would bring back the warmth of his shop, the way he used to wink when a joint fit just right, the quiet hum of his whistle as he worked late into the evening. No legal victory would replace the mornings I spent brushing his hair, the way he would sometimes grab my hand during moments of clarity and whisper, "You're my favorite blueprint, kid." I stared out the window as the streetlights flickered on. Somewhere, people were reading about me like I was a character in a story. But I wasn't a heroine. I wasn't a crusader. I was just a girl with nothing left to lose, who had chosen truth over comfort, legacy over silence. And now, I had to figure out what came next. Justice doesn't come like thunder. It doesn't crash in with drums and banners or erupt in cheers from a waiting crowd. It arrives like morning light through dusty blinds, soft, slow, reluctant at first. It creeps in while you're still bracing for darkness, uncertain whether to believe it's finally over. The day I got the call from the county clerk's office confirming that Harold's original will had been legally restored was cold, bright, and unsettlingly quiet. I was folding laundry in my kitchen, half distracted by the clink of the radiator and the hum of an old jazz record I'd rescued from Harold's shed. "Miss Mercer," the woman on the line said, her voice unusually gentle for a government employee. "You've been granted full probate rights under the reinstated testament. The fraudulent filing has been voided. I thought you should hear it from us before the papers arrive." I didn't cry. I didn't cheer. I simply stood there, one of Harold's flannel shirts in my hands, and let the warmth of vindication sink in, not as a flood, but as a deep, earned breath. The legal fallout came swift and messy. Richard was charged with willful fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of probate. The forged witness affidavits fell apart under deposition. One of the witnesses, a distant cousin Richard paid off with hush money and a promise of land, flipped immediately under pressure. The second turned out to be an associate from one of his side businesses, who confessed to signing the form without reading it. The county prosecutor took particular interest once Miriam's article gained traction, and within weeks, Richard's public image shifted from grieving son to predatory heir across every local and regional outlet. I didn't attend his arraignment. I didn't watch the interviews or read the think pieces about small-town greed and intergenerational property disputes. It wasn't about him anymore. The house was legally mine again by spring. When I unlocked the front door for the first time in months, my hands trembled, not with fear, but with reverence. The scent had changed since Harold passed, more dust and less cedar, more silence than memory. I moved slowly, touching familiar corners, opening windows, letting the light back in like a returning promise. I didn't move back in right away. I didn't even take a full tour that day. Instead, I sat in Harold's workshop with his old radio on low and began sketching on the back of an envelope, a rough blueprint for something that had been quietly forming inside me since the first moment I held that forged will and realized just how easy it was for stories to be rewritten. I wanted to build something Harold would have recognized, not just physically, but ethically. Something that honored the difference between legacy and possession. A place where stories couldn't be stolen with signatures or buried under legal fees. By summer, I had filed the paperwork. The Harold Mercer Foundation for Family Legacy and Grief opened officially the following fall, after 6 months of renovations, permits, and fundraising that came from small donors, community allies, and 2 anonymous gifts I later learned came from people Harold had helped decades ago. I didn't turn the house into a monument. I turned it into a living space for healing. The front rooms were converted into a grief resource center, a place where children who'd lost parents, or widows unsure of their next steps, could sit with counselors and ask impossible questions without judgment. The dining room, once the site of countless quiet suppers and deep December laughter, became a legal literacy classroom. We held monthly workshops there on ethical estate planning, power of attorney, caregiver rights, and how to protect your loved one's wishes when the system fails them. The upstairs bedrooms were kept largely intact. We used them for overnight retreats, storytelling circles, and, on rare occasions, emergency housing for survivors in crisis. One room held a small but growing library of memoirs, legal guides, and recorded oral histories from locals who had experienced betrayal, grief, redemption, or all three. Harold's workshop remained untouched. We opened it to visitors once a week. People came to see his tools, the carvings he left behind, the journals where he had written observations about character, craft, and integrity. I added only one thing to the space, a framed print of the will he left me, hung not as proof, but as a warning. And outside, in the side yard where he used to teach me to plant tomatoes, I built a bench. Not a sleek one. Not one polished for show. It was wide, sturdy, and imperfect, just like the man himself. On the backrest, I carved the words slowly, carefully, letter by letter. He taught me how to build. The first time my mother visited the center, it was late October, the leaves turning bronze and copper, the wind cutting just sharp enough to remind us both how long it had been. She stood in the doorway of the dining room, looking at the circle of chairs, the whiteboard filled with notes from the last legal workshop, and the vase of fresh chrysanthemums someone had donated from their garden. Her voice was thin when she finally spoke. "I didn't believe you. Not because I thought you were lying, but because I was afraid of what it would mean if you were telling the truth." I didn't say anything. I just let her sit in Harold's old chair, the one I had moved near the window, and watched as she took it all in. She stayed for 3 hours that day. Before she left, she reached for my hand, something she hadn't done in years, and said, "I'm sorry I told you to let it go. You were right not to." We didn't reconcile overnight. There were still hard silences between us, still old habits that made honesty difficult. But she came back the next month with a tray of muffins and asked if I needed help alphabetizing the intake forms. That was how I knew we were healing. As for Richard, he accepted a plea deal. He lost his license, his businesses, and any future claim to the estate. He sent me a letter once, handwritten, rambling about stress and father wounds and misunderstandings. I didn't write back. But I didn't destroy the letter either. I filed it, quietly, behind a legal folder marked history. Some things deserve to be remembered, but not revisited. People often asked if I felt triumphant. The answer was always no. I didn't win anything. I rebuilt. And building, as Harold taught me, is harder than winning. It takes time. Patience. The ability to see through splinters to the structure beneath. One afternoon, a teenager from one of our support groups asked if the bench outside was for a boyfriend. No, I said, smiling. It's for the man who taught me how to be myself. Even when it hurt. That night, I stayed late, oiling the bench as the sky turned indigo and the streetlights flickered on. My hands were tired, but steady. My grief had dulled, but not disappeared. It had simply reshaped itself into something else, something rooted. And as the stars emerged above that old, quiet house, I whispered the words I hadn't spoken aloud since his funeral. Thank you, Harold. I didn't just carry your legacy. I carved my own from it.